Good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Maryland Autism Research Consortium podcast. Today's podcast is on perspectives on neurodivergent students' transition from high school to higher ed or other ventures. In this second episode, we're going to talk to some experts in the K through 12 school setting, both private and public. I'm Kathy Dauberger, one of the co-directors of the UMARC here at the University of Maryland, with Nan Bernstein-Ratner, who works with us to provide this podcast service to listeners. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is important to many individuals and their families. As students go through the educational system and start to graduate from this system, they face what amounts to a service cliff. Today's panel will continue the discussion that our first panel of experts began a few weeks ago on being more prepared for the transition so that individuals and their families approaching this change can have greater peace of mind. Our first panelist is Lily Kern. Ms. Kern is the Director of Admissions and Outreach with Fusion Academy, Washington, D.C. Fusion Academy is an accredited private school serving students in 6th through 12th grade. At Fusion, every class has 1-to-1 ratio, just one teacher and one student. This unique school allows for a relationship-based learning experience that's tailored to fit the needs of each student. Because of the 1-to-1 model, they're able to create a customized and supportive learning environment based around their students' academic, emotional, and social needs. Welcome, Lily.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Gretchen Levine. Ms. Levine is the former transition specialist with the Catherine Thomas School program, with the Catherine Thomas High School program. KTS is a school that serves students with moderate to severe language-based learning disabilities, autism, and mild intellectual disabilities. She's a certified special education teacher with over 30 years of experience in working with children and adults with disabilities and their families. Welcome, Gretchen.
Thank you.
And our next panelist is Christina Sprague. Okay. Ms. Sprague is the transition specialist for Charles County Public Schools. She has 17 years of experience in education. Christina has also spent 4 years as a school-based therapist in Montana, working with students with severe emotional disabilities, 4 years as a behavioral specialist in Hawaii, and the past 9 years working in secondary transition. Christina has her Master's of Education and a Master's in Rehabilitation, Counseling, and Mental Health. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you.
And just to let your listeners know, all the listeners know, I'm a person who stutters, and occasionally I'll have some stutters, but I'll use strategies, so if it's not your sound, it's actually me using my strategies. So welcome, everybody. Okay. So what we decided to do for these podcasts is to orient the listeners of the most frequently asked questions that our school panelists encounter, as well as the nuggets of information that they feel most families can profit from learning during these K-12 transition years. As each of our panelists answer these questions, they will identify themselves by their first name so that the listeners will know which expert is talking. In our first podcast, our panelists spent some time talking about the differences between a person who is diploma bound and a person who is more certificate bound, or on those different tracks, and that there can be a hybrid of those two. But how early can a student and a parent be thinking about this transition period? So I'm going to start with you, Christina.
If it's up to me, I really encourage families to start at birth. I think that the transition process starts at birth. In the K-12 environment, we start at 14. That's what's required by law. And we're really pushing down into the middle schools with looking at how students build their, not only in middle school, but also their high school experience to support those post-secondary outcomes. So with families, I don't think it's ever too early. And it's really never too late either. Of course, we want to start early, but If you're in that process, you can always reach out and start wherever you are. But as a transition specialist, I always encourage you to start as early as possible, and definitely by the time the student's 14.
So when you talk about early as possible, what could be done prior to the age of 14 that would prepare for that? Yes, Lily?
I think that you want to just start prompting students to develop these independent skills. And so that can be everything from riding the metro to kind of working on a student's authentic sense of self. But, outside the world of, the IEP meeting, those transitions can look a lot of different ways. And when I work with my students, I want to see that that's an everyday practice and that teachers are on the same page and families are on the same page developing independent living skills.
Hi, this is Gretchen. I think I agree with everything that's been said, and just some caveats to the never too early, never too late. Sometimes you really have to judge your audience. Sometimes it can really overwhelm students to think about the future, and they'll shut down because they're so anxious about what that might entail, and their idea that they might not be able to depend on mom and dad anymore or have to live apart from family because they've developed this idea in their head. So that, I think, is important, and I definitely have encountered that with students. And with families, I think that to structure it, really having a template in middle school can be helpful. Towards the end of middle school, and that's when some of our students are turning 14 anyways, so it works out. But prior to that time, as Lily was mentioning, I think it's really important to help students find out what they're good at and what they enjoy doing, and really identify ways that they can take part in those activities in the community. So sometimes that can be in an inclusive setting, but other times that might not be able to happen. But either way, I think that really exploring interest and strengths and gifts is really super important.
Yeah, I do think that the life skills are important. So being able to take public transportation. I work on the other end, in the college end, working with students on the spectrum, and many of them don't have their license, their driver's license. They would like to have their driver's license, but they don't. And some have that as a goal, and others just don't want to work, towards that. And so being able to have the flexibility to be able to take the bus or the metro, or to know how to use an app to get from one place to another is really important. So, all right. So how do the schools you work at go about educating parents on the transition process? Is this standard for all high schools, or do each of you have your own guidelines?
For Catherine Thomas School, we started talking to families in 9th grade individually to look at all of the areas that would be affected by transition, what kinds of benefits families and students might be eligible to receive, what kinds of resources might already be available to them as young adults. And we also really encourage families to take advantage of the presentations and workshops that were offered by the county. And I'm pretty confident that each region in Maryland has the equivalent of Montgomery County's annual transition fair, where all the providers of resources for students in that 14 to 21 year and up range come together and have a fair, so there are resources available, resource booths available. They also do workshops on transition-related topics. It's a great time for families and students to kind of stick their toe in the water there.
So is this a statewide program, a school system program?
It usually, my experience has been, it's the school system, the Montgomery County Public Schools, for example, and then each high school would have their own they would participate in that bigger school program, but they would also offer programs for families right in the high school throughout the year. That does vary from school to school in my experience.
Yeah, I think ours feels similar. We have a post-secondary counselor that's a full-time staff member at Fusion, and the goal, in calling it post-secondary counseling, is recognizing that college might not be the right fit for every student, or might not be the right fit for every student right away, and that's okay. And so I think in this really highly competitive DC private school environment that we're all in, I often find that my students are so relieved to know that college transition or that post-secondary transition is going to happen, but slowly and supported, so that you're getting it all throughout your high school experience. So there's nothing to stop you from writing your college essay right in the 10th grade in a one-to-one environment. So it's just going to feel a lot more slow and a lot more student-centered.
Do you have anything to add, Christina?
I would say that starting at 14, we're required as part of the annual IEP process to develop a transition plan for each student that goes through and works with the students on doing assessment and also creating a plan for what the student will be doing post-secondary. So that allows us to really walk through and be student-centered in that process and talking with families about what the students' interests are. It also gives us an opportunity to educate them on the transition process. Part of the law also requires us to provide each family with the Maryland Transition Guide that gives an overview of the transition process, as well as some resources. There's also in there several websites that they could go to so we do a lot of training with our case managers on explaining that to parents, what the transition process is, how we support, what our role is, what their role is, what the student's role is, as well as what agencies are important in that post-secondary experience. In our county, probably about 5 years ago, I started a family conference where it's a full day. Families can come and learn about what the transition process is. I invite the Division of Rehabilitation Services, Developmental Disabilities Administration. Our local community college comes and talks about the transition to college. And that's been really helpful in getting the word out. So we have held that annually. Generally have about 100 families that have come out to that. So that, I think as we continue to have these things, getting the word out, and also providing workshops and seminars through our parent center. So they've been a great resource for us as well with getting information out to families.
Yeah, I think getting the word out is really a high need because some families, because of the work schedules, maybe culturally, maybe language barriers, those things may be really hard for people to feel comfortable attending. So do you have support resources for families who may not have opportunities to attend workshops?
One of the things that every family gets at the IEP meeting is that Maryland Transition Guide, which goes through and details what the transition process is, as well as those agency linkage and the adult service agencies, what they provide. So we do that. We also have our website where they can go to. So those are some of the resources that they're provided. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think just to add on to what Christina was saying, and this is Gretchen, having that time to meet individually with families, and it sounds like that happens at Fusion as well with students and families, I think is really key. And there are times that you're going to need to have an interpreter. So Catherine Thomas definitely supports that.
Do you want to add?
This is Lily. Yeah, I also like to make sure that more than just families, I guess maybe we'll get to it later on in the podcast, but making sure that the students that I'm working with are taking part in that process. And I love to direct people to some of the resources that Autism Speaks creates, which can be a great way for young people who are on the spectrum to be empowered in that process.
Yep. Very good. All right. So what's the difference between IDEA and ADA and the shift that happens?
Okay,
Yes,
this is Gretchen. I'll start. We're all looking at each other. So, to me, the biggest difference that parents need to adjust to coming from special education services is that through IDEA, education, all students are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. That they are not, through ADA, adults with disabilities are not entitled to a free, appropriate public education. And that's part of that service cliff that families and students feel when they exit the special education system.
This is Christina. Also like to add that it's important for parents to understand how the responsibility shifts. Under IDA, the responsibility is on the school to provide services that equate to success, where under the ADA, it's student-based. The student has to seek out those resources, and that law is more about access. So you have to go through and you have to seek out those services, and you have to be determined eligible. So, and I think it's also important to have discussions about what is covered under IDA that may not transition to those post-secondary education environments or to an employment setting, so that we make sure that we're addressing that and building skills to help the student be successful in those environments. I really try to have families begin the process with the end in mind, thinking about what skills are required in those next environments, and then kind of backward chaining that and talking about how we're going to build that so they can be successful.
Good. I guess this is Lily. My understanding too is that with IDEA, there can be some substantial changes that I guess are made to the content of a course, whereas in college and in a college setting, it's not going to be reasonable for a professor to intensely alter the content of the course to make it accessible to the students. So they're really going to need to think about and take ownership over getting the accommodations that they can and that the college can provide.
Yes, that actually makes me think about my students that are here at the university and trying to advocate for those accommodations, and even the organizational piece to be able to submit their accommodations forms, and to, if they're not getting it implemented the right way, what happens and what recourse do they have. And so, yes, Christina.
And this is Christina, and I would agree with that. I think in the most recent research I was reading, almost every IEP has accommodations in it. That's just the nature of the IEP services, although only about 17% of individuals are disclosing their disability and seeking out those services in the post-secondary education settings. So as educators, it becomes really important for us to have honest conversations with our students about what their disability is, or how that impacts their learning, and going back and really addressing the self-advocacy and self-determination piece of it, and helping students understand how they learn and why those services and supports are important, and then also helping them build the confidence and the strategies for seeking that out. Because some of our students' communication can be difficult. Also, there's a confidence piece that goes into that. So I think that that's really important when we're looking at helping them be successful once they leave our buildings.
It's something that I really love to see at Fusion. Maybe out of my 65 students, I'll have 10 to 12 who are on the autism spectrum, but I think because of the environment, they actually take a certain pride in the diagnosis, and for many of them, that diagnosis, it tells them that they weren't wrong, or they weren't bad, or they weren't stupid. It was that, their brains are just wired differently, and that's okay. But I love to see the correlation between the self-confidence and then the ability to self-advocate.
Yeah, I think there's a shift in terms of having shame or embarrassment with the autism spectrum diagnosis. And that leads me to the question of self-disclosure. In terms of transition and being able to advocate for themselves, anything done with self-disclosure, working with students before that transition? And what does that mean? And what does that look like?
Hi, this is Gretchen. That can be really challenging for students to get comfortable around, and it's something that they're going to look to their parents or their caregivers and how they help them to understand their disability. But I think one approach that has worked for our students is to look at their disability from a strengths needs perspective, and to talk about what they're good at doing and where they need help. and what that help can look like. And then students can really take ownership in describing the best way for the person who's there to help them to provide that assistance. Or, some students really love using the assistive technology, and other students don't like it and prefer not to use it. So you just have to work through those kinks. And I think the strengths needs takes some of the discomfort around the whole disability disclosure piece. But it's a personal decision as well.
Yeah, I think some of our students here on campus were changing the term. We're not using the disability term. We're calling it a student who is neurodivergent. And I think for populations that fit under that umbrella, it's more comfortable for them. And so, yes.
This is Christina. Last year, we implemented a pilot to where we were having students do self-directed IEPs, to where they put together a PowerPoint. They were going through and discussing what their post-secondary outcomes were, talking about their disability, and then also talking about their services. But I do agree that it's important to start with a strengths-based approach and really looking at those assets. Everyone has an assets, and really helping them understand how they learn, and that everybody learns differently. And so these are just accommodations to help you move forward. And with the students, we actually call it being a smart learner, because you're actually using your resources. So I think that that's really helped. That's been really helpful. Also this summer, we had 60 students that participated in summer youth employment. And so we had a presenter come in and talk about the ADA and present with them and present to them on what the requirements were for requesting accommodations in the workplace. And I think that that was really helpful. And we sat down and had a conversation about what do they need at school and how might that relate to the world of work, and helping them really make that connection.
All right. So we kind of touched on this in terms of self advocacy, but so what happens to a student who doesn't have this skill? And what happens to like the parent's position as well as they go through the transition process?
I think that if a student does, sorry, this is Lily. I always forget to say my name. This is Lily. And I think that students really experience that cliff of the services dropping off if they don't have the self-advocacy skills. I think I see it all too often in my line of work that, I have parents who are great advocates for their kids, and their kids are happy, but that doesn't necessarily translate to success in college. Because I think that my family's focused so hard, and I think the trap is to focus really hard on the social skills aspect, which is important in college, but at the neglect sometimes of the executive functioning skills and the mental health repercussions that can occur when your executive functioning skills aren't on par for a college environment, and things pile up and you get stressed. And so I've seen students, who have reached out later having sometimes dropped out or needed to seek a more supportive environment like CLE. And so I want to make sure that we are doing what we can to help kids really practice those self-advocacy skills so that they don't feel that drop off.
And could you define CLE for us?
Oh, it's college living experience. They're located out in Rockville, and it's a supported college environment that partners with Montgomery College. So students are going to, they live in kind of a consortium. There's a housing component, and then you're taking classes in a community college setting. And I think having some really structured time to reflect on what's going on, both socially and academically. So just with much more wraparound supports. And so I always like to recommend that program.
I agree with they experience this drop off. I think the other thing to kind of touch on is that as students enter employment or they go on to post-secondary education, parents aren't able to call and get student information because once they're there, they're an adult, and so they are protected with confidentiality, or at the work site, they don't want you calling. Even in the medical realm, when a student becomes 18, they are now legally an adult, and the parent can't access their files. So it's really important for students to be able to advocate across settings so that they can access employment, even in the community, for safety. So it's really built in where again, we start with the end in mind. What skills do they need to be successful in those environments, and how do we start working on those while they're still in school? Because I think the tendency is for the parents really advocating, and that's just kind of what they get stuck in. But we don't give the students sometimes the opportunity to really practice those skills and become proficient into those skills until they're at that cliff. And then we're looking at, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? So, yeah, I think it's hard because parents want to do the best and they want to be really involved, and that's great. But learning to step back a little bit and become a coach, so the student can be the front center person.
And this is Gretchen, and I'll just add from a more practical standpoint, helping students and their families start to look at the idea of self-advocacy, self-determination, and greater independence early in high school. Just one example is, who's responsible for getting the student out the door in the morning? Is it mom and dad, or is it the student? And that can be a really big indicator of someone's readiness to take a job, because they're the person who has to show up to the job on time. And same with college classes and getting yourself together. So from a real practical standpoint, I think there are things that as educators we can encourage our students to start practicing early on and taking on more responsibility. And then as they get older, oftentimes our high school students turn 18 while they're still at Catherine Thomas. So that's a discussion about decision-making and whether or not you want mom and dad to have information from your doctors, or to, in the future, be able to talk to folks at the college program or program that you're attending after you graduate. So I think starting early is really helpful.
I was going to say, one of the ways that we've tried to incorporate this in our student culture, every year we have a theme, and so the theme for last year was ownership for students, so that everybody, and ownership can mean such small things, right? It's getting your homework in, it's making sure that you're uploading your homework to our database, but it's also taking ownership of your actions with your peers. And so I liked what you were saying earlier, that it's never too early to start. And so these ideas of ownership empower students as young as 6th grade to be able to, be in charge of their own lives. And that's not to say that mom and dad won't be in charge of your life when you're in 6th grade, but you have to start adding it in.
Yeah, and I think adding, to the peace of mind part is that parents are getting older. And siblings have been part of the process sometimes, but they're getting older and moving on with life too. And so really that peace of mind, knowing that the families can trust that their student can carry on without them, and or know where to go find the resources. So how are schools preparing students to make new friends? Sometimes there's a transition from middle school to high school, then high school and beyond. And now they're starting to talk about dating. How do you handle dating, sex ed, all of those aspects in high school?
This is Lily, and this is my favorite topic. I think with honesty, it's actually, I find one of the wonderful things about working with young people on the autism spectrum is that honesty can sometimes be your constant go-to. And so I think that, not kind of veiling things for people is always really important. I also love nothing more than curating field trips or social activities for young people who are on the spectrum and who just may experience other social challenges, to be together and to practice these social skills around a shared kind of enjoyable experience. And so making sure that even in a small school environment, you're curating as an educator experiences where students can have social success and start to see what it might be like to date somebody, and knowing that they have adults to talk to about these complex feelings of adolescence, and that's okay. We're here to listen.
Implementing peers in our regionalized programs for students with autism. And this really focuses on explicit teaching of the skills. as well as giving students opportunities to generalize those skills. And I think that that's something that has been needed in sitting with families in IEPs and discussing what skills are needed for post-secondary outcomes. But I think beyond just exposing them to environments and beyond sitting and having discussions with them, the students really need an evidence-based strategy that gives explicit instruction and also provides them opportunities to generalize that with supports. So I'm really excited to implement that this year and see the outcome. Because I go and I observe classrooms and I'll see students with autism sitting and they might have a one-to-one or they're in the classroom and they're in the general ed environment, although what I don't see is true inclusion. So occupying the same classroom is not inclusion. But then we backward map that and talk about, well, why are they not being included or why are they not seeking out social engagement? And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, have we taught them the skills to be successful in that? So this year we're really excited to do that, and we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. So for our listening audience, PEER stands for the Program for the Education and Enrichment of Relational Skills. And it is an evidence-based curriculum that was developed through UCLA and had the empirical data up front, and then it was marketed as a manualized program. So it originally was an outpatient program, but it's been adapted for the school setting. And so some schools have been doing that. And I know Charles County, as far as I know, in the state of Maryland, they're the first ones that are doing this school-wide. So, yeah, kudos to you all for getting that started.
Yay, Charles County.
This is Gretchen. I second that. Yay, Charles County. So Catherine Thomas, one thing that is different from a typical school setting, and there are many differences, but there's very intensive social work and speech therapy, occupational therapy, supports as part of the student's day. So oftentimes those skills for friendships are explicitly taught through a social work group where you have a couple of students with similar interests, or even a speech therapy group where students are working together and I think underscore explicit instruction and then the opportunity to put those skills in place and practice them. So it's an excellent point. Good.
So I'm going to double back to the dating piece of it, because that is trickier, because when I see it in the higher ed, our college students who are not on the spectrum have been practicing these skills since middle school. They know how to flirt with their eyes. They know how to exchange information. They know when someone likes them, what happens with facial expression, body language, tone of voice, what's being said, how long it's being, even the length of the conversation can let somebody know if they like them or if someone likes them. It's trickier. It's more socially complex. It's a harder thing to teach. Any thoughts about what could be done or maybe what already is done in that area?
I know of an organization, this is Lily, that does parties for the neurodiverse. So a gentleman that I like very much out of Ivy Mount throws parties every month that are, if you're ready to chill with those kids, then you can come. And so they have video game tournaments on one side, and then on the other side, they'll have facilitated dancing. So, the can and the Congo line and dancing that feels more inclusive and more structured. Because kids were giving the feedback, like, how am I going to go out and hang with the neurotypical girls? Like, I need to get here and practice with people who are like me. And so I'm such a huge proponent of, I want to see things like peers being implemented, but also just opportunities for kids who are on the spectrum to go have fun and to maybe even have fun with their neurotypical peers surrounding an activity where people can be together, because I think that inclusion is so important.
I think that leads me to peer mentoring, the whole idea of having more strategic, more structured and unstructured activities that aren't to kind of script it out, more natural. Anybody have any ideas about peer mentoring and thoughts about what could be done or is done?
This is Gretchen. I'll jump in. I think that would be so exciting to explore that. I don't think we're there yet. Oftentimes, at least in my experience, the programs like Best Buddies, they tend to have groups of all girls coming in to work with a group of students who have disabilities. And a lot of times there are more boys in that group than girls. So I think it could be really exciting to explore how that could happen. One nice thing that we're able to do at Catherine Thomas is to facilitate those relationships within a very small community. So that's helpful. And we have dances every couple of weeks, so that helps students to practice those skills that they can then use when they're invited to the dance at their neighborhood high school or to a wedding in the family. So I think those opportunities to practice, as Lily was mentioning, are really important.
This is Christina. We're looking at building out some pre-employment transition services funded through DOORS, to where we partner with our College of Southern Maryland to bring in students with autism to do peer mentoring with our students within the high school, so they can have a support network and kind of do some kind of a youth group or a group on self-advocacy and self-determination, looking towards post-secondary education. So that's some things that we're thinking about, and I know that the Division of Rehabilitation Services is offering funding now for local school systems to really look at how we're using peer mentoring for our students, which is very exciting.
Yeah, this is Lily. I was just going to share another thing that I just think is kind of fun. I think that we've all actually been blessed by an uptake in video game culture and just nerd culture in general, because your neurotypical middle school boys and your autism spectrum middle school boys love the same things. And so we've been really excited. We've been talking with Auburn School about the possibility of getting an inter-school social skills LARPing group. LARPing stands for live action role playing, and it's where people come and they hit each other with foam swords for points. It's very Renfest, but all of the, I don't know, I think that it doesn't need to feel so serious, and so many times these things can be fun, and so I love to see kids getting engaged in activities like this, where the social skills it's sneaky, it's getting slid in, but it's there.
That's great. That's great to hear. All right. Until what age can schools provide services to students? Sometimes I hear one number and I hear another number. And then how does that connect to work or to transition to learning how to work outside of school?
This is Christina. So under special education, under IDEA, students are entitled to a free and appropriate education until they either receive a diploma or until the end of the year in which they turn 21. So students who are not receiving a diploma can stay and remain. Many of the school systems have programs that are specifically for students who need additional transition services. In Charles County, we have the Adult Independence Program. That program specifically focuses on community-based instruction and community-based vocational instruction. The goal is to provide students with the skills that they need to access further training, further employment, or just how to access their community. How do we go and shop and find the things that we need on a daily basis? How do we get around our community using either some form of public transportation? Students that are on the diploma track have different career paths. We currently have the career research and development, to where the first part is work readiness. The second part of that is work-based learning, to where students actually go out in the community for part of their day and work in the community. Through partnership with the Division of Rehabilitation Services during the summer, such as this summer, we had 60 students that were diploma bound. that we partnered with employers in the community, and they worked for 6 weeks, 30 hours a week. Several of them were offered paid employment out of that. So there is opportunities to build work into that. I think, and really working through the transition plan to make that connection between their high school experience or their educational experience with the world of work, and understanding that all students, all employees, future employees need those basic academic skills, whether you're going to go straight into work or whether you're going to be an astronaut. All students need some type of entry-level skill so they can understand why they're at school. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. And for students with autism, we really have to find out what their interest is. What are their direct interests? What are their skills? And really help motivate them. I had a student who was really interested in shoes, so we focused a lot of what we did around shoes, and I ended up getting him a job working in the back room at a shoe store, and he was phenomenal there because he could size the shoes, put them, he actually unloaded the trucks and then handled the whole back warehouse. And he was just happy. That was his world. It was structured. It was the same thing every day, and he thrived. So I think it's really important through good transition assessment, having those conversations, and then looking at building those work experiences in. It's the number one predictor of post-school success.
This is Lily. I was going to say we had a student in a similar situation who loved nothing more than hospitality, super warm and receptive, and loved hotels. And so we were able to get him a job, like sort of sorting mail at the hotel, smiling and making nice and helping the room service people, and he thrived. So to your point, Christina, it's so important to know your students and to know what they're interested in, because it's going to have such a tremendous indication for the workplace.
This is Gretchen. So we've had students that have, through their job internship, which is a part of their high school experience for all the Catherine Thomas School students, they have been recruited to continue their employment, especially our students that have worked with child care programs. That's been a good match. I think that I would just add on that it's challenging for us to get that data after students leave and tracking everybody down to find out how things are working out for them. One informal way that we've been able to do that, a couple of ways, are through an alumni listserv that parents use and exchange information. I think that's been helpful. The students stay in touch with each other through Facebook. And then we have a couple of events that students who have graduated come back for. One is a basketball game for alumni versus students or staff, and that's very popular. And then something that's our version of a homecoming. So the informal ways as well as formal ways to find out how people are doing.
Yep. I just wanted to add one of my favorite stories from this summer about the importance of work. We had a student who participated in our summer youth employment experience who came, and the staff was really concerned because he needed a lot of support. In the educational environment, he needed one-to-one, and he had extreme difficulty, a lot of sensory things going on. So he was really interested in working with animals, so we put him at the local Humane Society. He did phenomenal. With the right support, he was very successful, completed all 6 weeks. He actually was training some of the other students and some of the other staff there because we put in picture task analysis for him, was able to fade that out. He knew his job. They just loved him there. And the positive thing about that is given a change of environment and increase the expectation with the appropriate supports, he thrived. And the exciting thing is when he returned back to school, they have been able to fade his one-to-one, and the mom reports that he's more independent doing his chores at home. And so it's really exciting because sometimes when we're in the school building, we'll look at a student and be like, I don't know, I think they're going to need a lot of support. Or I don't know if the student's a really good candidate for this. I don't know if we have the appropriate level of support for them. But then putting them out there and seeing them thrive in a different environment when they're around non-disabled peers and the expectations change for them, and we hold them to a higher standard and expect them to interact like adults and give them the right supports, they thrive. And then to see that carry back to the educational setting and see it is just, it's really rewarding, and it's exciting to see.
Yep. I really love hearing these stories, and
Too.
I was just realizing when I heard about the alumni group, families who have already walked through this are a great resource. They already know what should have been done or what could be done, and I think they really want to be part of the process. That's great. So we just have a few more minutes. I want to go around and have everybody just give any other advice, information that we didn't touch upon that you thought about and we just didn't cover it yet?
This is Gretchen. Just one kind of random practical piece of advice is that students who have the opportunity to participate in summer programs, summer camp, or even college prep programs, that opportunity to live away from home is really helpful towards transition, because it's a time where they're having to be more self-reliant. It's also a confidence builder, and usually, camp is fun. It's not about, work or school. So I think that's something for families to explore.
Okay, thank you, Gretchen.
I think for me, I just want to go back and kind of touch on again the expectations of everybody working with that student, that holding high expectations for students while having those supports in place, and looking at what their neurotypical peers are doing and provide them the same opportunities. Sometimes I feel like we're so afraid of them making a mistake or not being successful that we don't offer them the opportunity to learn and to have those normal experiences that their peers have of encountering disappointment, encountering things that are more difficult. But they also, when they can get through that struggle and feel that sense of accomplishment and that sense of pride, that builds character. And I feel like that's an important component too. So keeping those expectations high.
Thank you.
I think this is Lily, and I think that failure in so many ways is awesome. It's one of the greatest things that we have, and that for these students, resiliency is something that's massively important and needs to be practiced. And so college will not be easy for you, and that's okay. College is not easy for many people. But if we're practicing the self-advocacy skills and we're building in opportunities to practice resiliency in middle school and in high school and even elementary school, I think the outcomes for success for these students is so much higher. So we need to start now.
Yep. And I do agree with all of you saying that there's no rush, sometimes, and there's also pressure. When we had the experts talk in the first podcast, in the DMV, there's so much, there's an expectation for our students who can go to higher ed to go to higher ed. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's just not a good fit, or maybe just not yet. Mm-hmm. And so there's no rush. And so I think all the information that you've provided has been so valuable. It's added more pieces to where we want to keep continuing. And so I just really want to thank all of you for being here. And I really appreciate your time, your knowledge, your openness, and your love for what you do. It really does show. Okay. So we're concluding our second podcast on transition with our school personnel. Next UMARC panel will be college students and actually transitioning 11th, 12th graders and college students who are on the spectrum. We'll have that in the last week of October. And we will be airing this podcast in a couple of weeks. We just launched our first podcast last week, and you can find that in our website, which is autism.umd.edu. And I'd like, again, to thank our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.